Hi everyone, today we're going to talk about garlic mustard education. My name is Nicole Schill. I'm with Medina County Park District, and we're going to break up this presentation into several parts. So we're going to talk a little bit about the forest floor habitat to describe what we are protecting. Then we'll get into garlic mustard ecology, talking about how it's a problem. Then we'll get into management. What are we going to do about the problem? And then finally, the partnership that's going to make that management happen. So spring ephemerals are wildflowers that bloom in early spring, and they've filled this niche area where they will bloom before the trees leaf out. And they're valuable for lots of reasons, one being their intrinsic beauty. It is such a joy to go visit these habitats in the springtime and see all of these different flowers blooming. And it's a very diverse display of wildflowers in such a short amount of time. And usually you can see lots of different wildflowers in a small area. They provide food for wildlife, and they've forged these complex and essential relationships with native insects. And as we go through the presentation, we're going to see how those complex and essential relationships are so important to our ecosystem. So this is just a collage of some of the different wildflowers that can be found in Ohio in springtime. Everything from bloodroot to cutleaf toothwort, mitrewort, jack in the pulpit, foam flower, wild ginger, trout lily, and several others. We talk about complex and essential relationships. One we can start with is the hummingbird, the ruby-throated hummingbird that likes to come visit the eastern red columbine. So red is a color that's known to be visible to birds, and that in combination with it being a long spurred plant with its nectar deep inside, the flowers are ideally suited for these hummingbirds. And the bloom time of columbine it coincides with the time that the ruby-throated hummingbirds arrive in this area, and as they continue to migrate further north. Columbine is also attractive to beetles, butterflies, and bees. Another really cool wildflower that you can see out there on the forest floor is red trillium and Cecil trillium. So both of these are kind of unique in that they are this red color and they stink. So they have kind of a bad odor. And those two characteristics combined make them a very good mimic of carrion. So dead flesh. So this then attracts their pollinator, which is different flies and beetles. Some of the fun nicknames for these plants are toadshade. You can imagine a toad kind of hiding underneath those little flowers, those little petals there and their leaves, and stinking Benjamin because of the odor. Dutchman breeches is a kind of a unique looking flower, and it's one of my favorites. It resembles some pantaloons hanging on a clothesline. This uniquely shaped flower has a relationship with bumblebee queens, all bumblebees, but bumblebee queens in specific. They are blooming at the time that the bumblebee queens emerge from their winter hibernation. So bumblebee colonies do not survive the winter. The bumblebee queen is the only member that's going to survive. So when she emerges from her winter hibernation, energy, nectar is going to be crucial and very, very important. The entire rest of the colony is relying on the survival of this one individual to create the next colony for the year. So when the bumblebee queen emerges, it is at the same time, it kind of coincides with Dutchman breeches. And these are one of the few insects that have the mouth parts that are suited for pollinating Dutchman breeches. So their tongue is long enough and strong enough to pry open those petals and then get inside there and get that nectar out of there. Shown here is the West Virginia white butterfly, and it is on a long spurred violet. This small white butterfly is a relative of the vegetable garden pest, the cabbage white. But in appearance, it lacks the dark spot that the cabbage white has, and it has a different host plant. So in the early spring, the West Virginia white butterfly will lay its eggs on spring ephemerals like toothworts in the cardamine genus. So one's pictured there in the bottom left. And the caterpillars will feed on those leaves and develop on that plant. But the adults rely on violets for their nectar source. We're going to talk a little bit later about garlic mustard and how it's impacting this species. So this is now a species of concern as its population continues to decline. So there's a chemical in garlic mustard that the butterflies find attractive. It's synegrin, which is the same chemical that's found in these in its native host plant. So the butterflies will get confused and lay its egg on the garlic mustard leaves, and they have a significantly diminished success rate when the caterpillars are laid or are growing on garlic mustard instead of its host plant. So not very many survive to adulthood if they're accidentally laid on that plant instead. So we'll kind of touch back on that a little bit further down the line when we talk about the properties of garlic mustard. Next up is the spring beauty miner bee. I find these to be just adorable little bees. They're very, very small and come out in early spring, and they are specialists on the spring beauty. So the males pictured here are especially charming in my opinion. They tend to be a little bit slimmer than the females, and they have a white mustache right there, which I find completely charming. So these are specialists that have filled a niche in this ecosystem. And since they're really, really good at harvesting one thing, they're really good at this the Claytonia genus, they can outcompete other generalists on this flower. So this is, again, another one of those complex and essential relationships that we're trying to preserve in our ecosystems. Next up is large flowered Trillium. This is an easy flower to use as our champion when we talk about what are we preserving. So if I think about some of our parks like Hubbard Valley and River Styx that have really good Trillium displays, this is a complex and essential relationship that also happens to take quite a bit of time. So Trillium, large flowered Trillium, they don't disperse their seeds by wind. Their method is to entice ants within a lysome. So attached to each seed is a blob of soft yellow stuff, right? That's the lysome. This is very nutrient rich. The ants then will carry that seed from the flower down into their nests and then chew off and eat that lysome, leaving the seed behind. So this process then will actually is the main mode of dispersal for Trillium. They move around their seeds through this enticing process. So the ants have been observed to carry Trillium as far as 30 feet from the plant. So Trillium aren't unique in that. Other spring wildflowers will also rely on ants like bloodroot, Trillium, trout lilies, and hepatica. All right, and this is a little bit of a close-up. You can see an ant carrying that seed, and then that light colored area there, a nutrient-rich piece. So when I think about the very large displays of Trillium at Hubbard Valley, I'm really struck by how long that process took to get a beautiful display like that. So Trillium is a slow-growing plant, and it can take up to 7 years for a Trillium to flower for the first time. The seeds will not germinate the first season since they need to overwinter in order to break their dormancy. The following season, they will produce just a single rudimentary leaf. That's the cotyledon right there on the screen. In their third year, they will produce a single ovate leaf and will continue to produce this one leaf and then go to rest. The next year, by the fourth year, they will usually produce their characteristic 3 leaves, the tri in Trillium. And then if everything goes well and they continue to escape deer browse, if they have enough sunlight, enough energy, they will be able to produce a flower within the 5th year. But that's not always the case. So it could be a cycle of several years for the plant to produce a 3-leaved plant and then go dormant and then continue to do that season after season until it has stored enough energy to produce a flower. And on the long end, it can take even 15 to 20 years to be reproducing and making seeds. So when I think about these very vast and beautiful displays of wildflowers over at some of our parks, I realize that this is a very sensitive habitat that's worth protecting. And if we don't, it will take a very long time to recover, or if it can at all. So let's talk about the culprit. Garlic mustard is an invasive species that was first observed in the United States in around the 1800s. It was brought over and introduced as a cooking herb and a food source. It kind of smells and tastes a little bit like garlic and onions combined, at least it does to me. But all of our literature cites that it has a garlicky smell. So an invasive species is a non-native and has been placed on a special list from the state of Ohio that prohibits this plant from being sold, propagated, distributed, or moved around at all because of the economic environmental harm that it can cause. So some of its characteristics are it's very tolerant to shade, and different conditions allow it to grow very well in woodlands, right? So this is the habitat that we're talking about protecting. So when it enters into a woodland, it can outcompete and displace native plants and then subsequently native insects and all of their other wildlife that relies on those wildflowers. So as this comes in, it's very, very aggressive. It can, and after a while, it will form these very dense stands of monocultures. So you can see in this picture here, it's quite tall. It shades out the other plants and robs them of light and nutrients from the soil. As I was saying at the beginning, these wildflowers have a complex and essential relationship where they and a niche fit into the ecosystem, where their moment to shine is they pop up, they want to grow as fast as they can, produce flowers, produce seeds, and do all of this in a short amount of time before the leaves on the trees leaf out and then start producing more shade on the understory. So garlic mustard kind of interrupts this process. It can grow earlier, it grows very tall, and then it itself can shade out these wildflowers. In addition to that, they emit allelopathic chemicals into the soil. So they actually actively discourage and harm the other plants around it, so they can't grow as strong or at all. And then it has no natural predators here. Even the deer are not interested in eating it. So how do we identify garlic mustard? One of the easiest ways to identify garlic mustard, if you're ever in doubt, if you think you're pretty sure but want to be positive, is your sense of smell. So these leaves, if you kind of rub them or crush them, they will emit a pretty strong, spicy odor that's kind of garlicky and oniony. They are biennial. So the first year of growth is a rosette, a basal rosette. Basal meaning closest to the ground, and then the rosette is talking about its growth form, how there's all these leaves and they kind of come back to a central point. Garlic mustard has a very, very large, a big fat root. It has a bunch of small ones, but there's one distinctly large one where it's storing all of this energy, which is another reason why it is such an aggressive invasive. It really stores this energy. In its second year, the plant will continue to have its basal rosette, and then we'll send up these long, tall flower stalks. At the top, there will be a bunch of nice, bright white flowers. And in some ways, it's kind of nice because it makes it pretty easy to spot. Even if you're walking the trail and you see these white flowers towering above others, pretty good indication that it's garlic mustard. If we look closer, garlic mustard has 4 petals. The petals, the flower then eventually will develop into seed pods. They're kind of like a pod-like structure here. The long, skinny structures that are coming up will produce seeds. And then as those seeds mature, they'll kind of turn brown before those pods, those pod-like structures split open and produce those seeds, release them. Michigan State University cites that a dense stand of garlic mustard can produce about 12,500 seeds per square yard each year. And each one of those seeds can remain viable in the soil for up to 10 years. So after a colony establishes, it will quickly turn into a monoculture and will just crowd out everything else in the area, which is a problem. So I wanted to go over just a couple lookalikes of what could be potentially confused with garlic mustard. At first glance, sweet Cecil could look like garlic mustard. It has kind of a tall growth form with small white flowers, but the flowers are much smaller than garlic mustard. And if you look at the leaves of the plant, they're very different than garlic mustard. This is cutleaf toothwort. If you remember, it is one of the natives we talked about earlier. It has 4 petals, but in kind of at first glance, the flower itself might look like garlic mustard. But again, the leaves are very different, and it's a much shorter plant. This one only grows a few inches off of the ground. Colt's foot is a non-native that vaguely resembles the basal leaves of garlic mustard. Coltfoot leaves will come up first, and then later is followed by those yellow flowers you see there. This one should be pretty easy to distinguish from garlic mustard. The leaves are a lot larger. They don't grow in big clumps like garlic mustard, and they kind of have a soft hair on the leaves. Now, violets are probably one of the trickiest ones to distinguish between garlic mustard rosettes, especially at first glance, and if the violets aren't actually on the leaves yet. So if you look closely at the veining, the violet veins tend to kind of follow the leaf margin around, while garlic mustard tends to have kind of a web of veins. It's very heavily branched. Again, you can always use the smell test. You don't need to destroy the plant in order to smell it. You can kind of rub your fingers very heavily on the leaf and get that odor. And then lastly, to kind of figure out if this is garlic mustard or violets, if you follow the leaf all the way back down to the ground, violets come up as individual plants and won't have a central point that comes out of the ground of the rosettes like the garlic mustard does. So that's a pretty good way to distinguish between the two. Ground ivy is extremely common. You see it growing in your yards. It's a non-native, but it's not invasive. Again, it looks pretty similar to garlic mustard in its kind of kidney-shaped leaves. There are some webbed veining, but they're generally kind of a darker color than garlic mustard, and shoot off runners. They're kind of like a long growing ivy. So between those two things, you should probably be able to figure out the difference. So garlic mustard leaves are kind of like a yellow green, and then ground ivy tends to be a little bit more dark as well. So I don't think that poison ivy is going to be confused with garlic mustard, but this is a plant that will grow in very similar habitats as garlic mustard. So to identify poison ivy, each leaf is made up of 3 leaflets, and these leaflets can have a smooth edge like the larger picture shows, or occasionally they have a little bit of a tooth edge. As the leaves mature, they kind of look shiny. And the reason why we want to be able to identify this plant is it's one of the few plants, humans are one of the few animals that are allergic to this plant. So there's an oil that it produces that when it gets on your skin will cause 1 in 4 people are not allergic, but for the most people it will cause a rash. It can also grow in a viney form. So if you see a thick, hairy vine, that is likely poison ivy. So we're going to be out in the field, in this habitat. So there are some products that you could use as a pre-contact, or if you do get in poison ivy, you can protect yourself and try the post-contact with a wash. So this is not an endorsement for the effectiveness of these brands, but these are just a few that are out there on the market. So how are we going to manage garlic mustard? So there's a few different management techniques that can be used. One of them is to cut the head of the flower before the flower develops. So as that stalk is coming up, to go through and cut them, and then also remove those flower heads that you cut off from the area. One of the downsides to this is it can be quite tedious, and you have to continue to come back to the area to monitor for new flower stalks to see if they've popped back up. It's a very aggressive plant, and it will continue to try to put that flower on even after cutting. Another method is to use a weed torch. This can be used to destroy the tender seedlings. This is not something that we typically practice because of the forest habitat that we're going to be in. So you want to use extreme caution if you decide to use this method, and definitely do some more research and look up on the best ways to do that and protect yourself. Another method to control a garlic mustard is herbicide. So this would be something that could be considered in an area that has extensive problems. The herbicide would be applied to rosettes in October, kind of early in its growing season since the biennial, and make sure that all labels are read and followed, and that, again, you protect yourself when using any of these methods. The management technique we are currently seeking help with, and we use by far the most at Medina County Park District, is mechanical removal. So physically removing the entire plant from the area. And we do this in spring before the plant produces a flower. We'll send teams of volunteers out into the habitats with black trash bags to collect all of the garlic mustard, because this is not something that we can compost. It's a very aggressive plant, and even when removed, if it stays moist or if it stays in a big pile, it will continue to turn those flowers into seeds and still produce. And since we learned that the seeds can stay viable from 5 to 10 years in the soil, this is a process that we have to go back and continue to monitor year after year. So we have had pretty good success in some areas that have had continual yearly removal. And we're back again this year to remove some more. As with any invasive species, the best management, the number one thing that we can do is prevention. So it's maybe something that we don't think about enough, but when we visit different habitats, you go from one park to another park, it's important that we clean any equipment that we take with us. Even if you're casually just hiking, washing your shoes, washing your boots between visits, and making sure you remove any mud that could have had seeds stuck up in the mud is going to be very, very important for prevention. So that way we don't move these seeds on accident from one habitat to another. And of course, proper disposal of the plant, so that way they don't continue to develop and produce those seeds that we don't want. So the Medina County Park District has partnered with the Ohio State University Extension Master Gardener Volunteers of Medina County. So back in 2019, this partnership began, and we've been working together since to engage the public and in the community to try to be more educated, more aware of what's going on. So the Master Gardeners took this a step further, just beyond just the garlic mustard, and have formed a woodland health committee. Medina County Park District volunteers and Master Gardener volunteers have partnered together for long-term management, to advocate for native wildflowers, engage public to spread awareness, and for removal. And we've been achieving this through educating scouts and other youths looking for service projects, by educating homeowners for proper management, by suggesting alternatives in your garden for planting instead of planting invasives, and also hosting and engaging the public through actually removing the plant, and then yearly wildflower talks and walks. So again, these are just some of the wildflowers that we are trying to protect. I encourage all of you to go out and visit the different woodland habitats we have this spring. See if you can challenge yourself to learn a few new native species. Maybe see if you can identify that garlic mustard. And then if anybody would like to become more involved, I encourage you to visit our website, www.medinacountyparks.com. There you can find information on how to volunteer, how to get involved in garlic mustard, or if you'd like to attend any public programs. Okay, and thank you all so much for watching.